What news stories mattered most this week in the world of media and advertising? Today, we will try to answer that question in 20 minutes or less. I'm Jack Benjamin.
And I'm Ella Sagar.
We're reporters for The Media Leader, and this week we'll be covering the latest news about the UK general election and much more. Ella, first of all, how was your bank holiday weekend?
Oh, it was lovely on the Saturday, I think, which was our nicest day. Barbecue. And that's bank holiday life. I think we're sorted. Yeah.
Fantastic.
How about yours?
It was good. It was nice that it lined up with a holiday in the US, Memorial Day. So
yeah, quite rare,
everyone in the US and UK were off at the same time. It was very rare. But speaking about the past week, there's been lots of election news. Ella, would you say that that's the most important story of the past week in media?
I think undoubtedly, obviously, the coverage of what was happening last week with Rishi Sunak calling the election and then what happens next and is going to be what's on everyone's minds at the moment. And there is a bit of uncertainty, even though it's likely Labour is about 20 points ahead. It's that kind of time where campaigning's about to start and everything's about to get into gear.
Yeah, it'll be the first time I'm in the UK for a general election, and actually I'll be on holiday.
Oh no!
when the election actually happens. So
it's a much shorter election cycle, I think.
It's a very short election cycle, and it also took people a little off guard, and that includes members of maybe Sunak's own party, but also people in the media industry. There was a sudden rush to try and get as many media-related bills over the line in the current parliament before it was prorogued. Ignorant American here speaking. And that happened at the end of last week. So it was a really short amount of time, like 2 to 3 days to get some bills passed. I thought it would be good to sort of take a look at what was and what wasn't passed. Ella, one of the first things, of course, the media bill got passed. It's now the Media Act.
Yes.
What was in it and why is it so important?
So I've been following this for a while. It has provisions for broadcasters, so that affects radio and that also affects TV as well. And the idea behind it was to update the existing legislation for a technological age. So including on-demand services under Ofcom regulation, for example, and including more provisions for smart speakers and connected TVs and those sorts of things, which have become a fact of life for many people. And so those were some of the main bits. And in some of the reporting around it, it was kind of seen as like world leading measures, that this is what was put forward as a preventative, rather than wait for issues to arise in future from not putting this in place now, which is quite a good thing to see for radio, commercial radio, TV players in the space.
What kind of issues could have happened? What were they trying to head off?
So it relates to due prominence on things like connected TV and smart speakers. So obviously on those kind of devices, like the tech companies could have changed the rules to make sure that the prominence was not necessarily given to broadcasters. So there was those sorts of elements that meant that they hadn't changed the rules yet, but they could have done, right. And that would have made it much harder to discover your radio station or the TV channel that you wanted than it should be, basically.
So it's sort of like if Google releases a smart speaker and decides, we really don't, we would prefer to promote our own podcast app or something instead of a radio station, that's no longer necessary.
Or, for example, could ask broadcasters to pay for carriage. So that, if you want to be on our Alexas, for instance, in the case of Amazon, then you would have to pay us. And that's not a position that the broadcasters really want to be in, obviously.
Gotcha. And another part of the Media Act is a repeal of Section 40 of the Crime in Courts Act, which I know publishers were very excited about. The idea there being that with Section 40, publishers could have been forced to pay both sides of their legal costs if they were sued. Is that correct?
Yes, and if they were not a member of a press regulator that had a royal charter.
Right.
So it was trying to deter publishers trying to encourage them to be part of a regulator. So that was, but it had never been used since it had been introduced. But I think it was quite reassuring for publishers to have that taken out. And then a few other bits that were in there that, Channel 4's business model about being able to produce and monetize more of its own programming and having a focus on quality programming, and changing the rules around public service broadcasters, of which Channel 4 is one, so that they have more of a focus on that high quality programming.
Was included in the Media
That was
Act.
included as well in the Act. Yeah, and then Ofcom will now, they have a code for video on demand services like Netflix, Amazon Prime and Disney Plus, which that I think is something they'll have an editorial standard similar to, broadcast TV. So you can make a complaint to Ofcom about content on those platforms now.
Definitely some big developments. There was another bill that was passed that I wanted to give some time to. That was the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Bill, the DMCC. This bill grants the Competition and Markets Authority, also known as the CMA, the ability to directly enforce consumer protection laws and fine companies up to 10% of their global turnover for breaches. In other words, it'll sort of similar to, sounds like parts of the media bill, sort of help address the market dominance of big tech, especially in digital environments. It would also allow the CMA's Digital Markets Unit to compel big tech to pay for news content that appears on their platform. So we'll see whether or not the Digital Markets Unit will actually action that now that it's been given those powers. But it was definitely well received from news publishers in particular. The News Media Association, their CEO, Owen Meredith, said that it marks a very important milestone in addressing market failure in the digital economy and ultimately delivering a level playing field between publishers and platforms. So that's definitely one to watch to see, how those regulatory bodies will actually take action now.
Yeah, and if how much teeth they'll have. And 10% of global turnover is a significant amount.
Yeah, well, I think one of the big complaints is often that you have big tech companies that might not really follow the law all that well in terms of competition law, but then the fine is sort of just seen as a cost of doing business because it's such a small amount of the huge amount of money that they make.
And I think it's worth noting that quite a lot of the laws, the legislation in here is partially as a result of Brexit and having to have our own UK kind of legislation introduced because we no longer comply with the EU law. Like EU has competition laws and lots of things like that. But we're having to kind of make sure that there is provisions now in the UK for various different parts of the media ecosystem to make sure that it is as kind of protected as in the EU.
Yeah, it's a really good point. There were, however, some pieces of legislation that didn't get passed during this wash-up period before Parliament was prorogued. I'll get it right at some point. Prorogued. It's a very challenging word. You have to admit. Okay. Well, dissolved is they'll be dissolved. Yes. They'll be dissolved later this week. But they were prorogued or approved. So one bill that did not pass that is somewhat relevant to the media industry is the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill. So that will have to remain a priority for the next government. So that bill would have provided regulations relevant to the access of user data, including data sharing for law enforcement, for health and social care data, biometric data. The idea as well with that bill is to hopefully promote more AI companies to come in and do their work in the UK as part of that sort of a broader sort of data protection framework. They want to create some more opportunities for that business as well. But it's an interesting one for, there's been so much conversation around data protection, data privacy. This is an important bill for that part of the country, but also the media industry would be impacted by this, presumably. So that didn't pass.
Okay. So I suppose in their prioritizing of different bills that would be taken through the wash up and which ones wouldn't, is it kind of which ones were furthest along in terms, because obviously there's like multiple stages. For those that don't know, two houses, House of Commons and House of Lords, and you've got 5 stages in each, and then you have to have royal assent at the end. And so it takes quite a lot of time to get everything through. And I would imagine that you can't kind of, even though it does seem like a bit of a rush at the end, that actually a lot of the work had already been done.
It's true that the media bill and also the DMCC bill were really far along. When it comes to urging them and rushing towards passage, it wasn't really rushed. It was more just like, we're basically at the finish line. Let's just get it over the finish line, make sure that any last minute amendments to those bills are considered and then passed or declined. And then the bill ultimately becomes an act. In the case of the DPDI bill, there seems like there were just some lingering disagreements mainly between the Conservatives and Labour over some of the nitty gritty of the bill. And so it wasn't quite as far along in that sense, which is why it didn't get passed. Yeah.
And the other legislation that that didn't get through was the high fat, sugar and salt legislation, or HFSS, which I'm sure many of our listeners will be familiar with. How urgent, like a priority, do you think this is for the next government?
Well, there's an actual timeline in terms of how urgent it should be. So yeah, just to be a bit clear, this is secondary legislation to the Health and Care Act, which I believe was passed in 2022. That involved, sort of bans on advertising for, as you mentioned, HFSS brands. However, that original legislation didn't include really many specific details in terms of what are the guidelines for this ad restriction. Is it going to apply to certain media channels more than other media channels? Are certain types of brands not included or are included? Because there's lots of high fat foods that might not necessarily be unhealthy. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think when I've spoken to people in the past, I think a lot of consumers and then also advertising professionals can see, junk food, for example, fast food, that makes sense to a greater or lesser extent. But then, for example, cheese is very high in fat. And so like your local a farmer's market with a cheese store, could they advertise under these new rules? And then there are lots of other things like actually something that might seem healthy. And there was quite a big scandal a few years ago where, salads in supermarkets were found to have more fat than other because of like different dressings and other things that had been included. So then they would have to really be quite careful about what they pick to advertise a new like menu or restaurants and things like that. And whether there's an understanding of like, this is a treat and not an everyday thing, and where you advertise. I think Outsmart, which is the trade body for out-of-home advertising, already has kind of rules around HFSS advertising in proximity to schools. And so that's already there as a kind of an agreement. But it just needs to be qualified, like exactly how far that goes. And because, for example, someone could still see an advert for it on their phone or on social media quite easily.
Right. So there's just a bit of a lack of clarity. This secondary legislation would have addressed that. It hasn't gone through, and the new Health and Care Act comes into force, I believe, October 2025. So brands are already starting to want to plan their ad campaigns and don't know exactly how they're going to do it. So for the next government, this actually will have to remain a high priority, at least according to people that I've spoken to, especially like at ISBA. This is definitely a key thing for them. So something to watch, certainly. But something else that I wanted to sort of discuss very briefly was sort of any other general reactions that the industry has had in terms of this new election being called, what they would like to see from the new government. We've talked about some priorities in terms of legislation that wasn't already passed. But what are other concerns that you've heard from people?
I was working on a story at the moment about about what should be the top media priority. Obviously, everyone would have their own political or personal views on what the next government should prioritize. But in terms of media, a lot of the news at the moment is around online safety, particularly as there is conversations in committees about a total ban on smartphones for under 16s and whether that should be prioritized or whether it should be more of a digital literacy or regulation of social media and which part of that. But I would just say enhanced online safety is coming up with a lot of people, whether that's a media owner, media agency, and trade bodies, because the online is where a lot of us spend most of our time these days, and it's increasingly clear that it's not as safe and it's not having a great impact on young people as it could do if there were some changes implemented.
Some other things that I've heard as well, AI is going to be a big one, especially for publishers. The News Media Association released a manifesto earlier this week calling for 5 key policy areas that it believes requires immediate attention from the next government, and AI and intellectual property, and resolving some of those uncertainties around should news publishers, like how protected are they from big AI companies coming in and scraping their data, and making sure copyright law is well settled on this area is really important for publishers, for artists as well. And then there were other, of course, priorities that the NMA has outlined as well, including press freedom, making sure that commercial publishers in the BBC, there's like a proper settlement. That's been a big issue for especially local news recently, and otherwise just sort of recognizing the importance of local news media. Those are some priorities that were outlined from the NMA, and also in discussions with people like at the PPA and et cetera. So I know that those are big issues for a number of publishers as well. So definitely lots for the government to take up. Whoever is the new leader will have lots on their plate in terms of media-related legislation that they should probably be considering, at least according to people within the industry that we've spoken to.
Absolutely. One other story I wanted to quickly highlight was also related to AI, and it was with fintech company Klarna announcing that it has cut its sales and marketing spend by 11% in the first quarter of this year, despite increasing the number of campaigns that it has run. And AI has apparently been responsible for about 37% of those cost savings. And the company reduced its external agency spend by 25%.
These are huge figures.
So yeah, really, double-digit figures.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering what your take on that was.
Yeah, I saw this story, and I was genuinely a bit shook, because that's a significant amount of costs that is saved that would otherwise be going
millions
to
of dollars.
agencies. Yeah, exactly. Annualized, it would be, I think, like 10 million. So yeah, it's significant. My questions are sort of, are other companies going to follow suit? Are they going to be looking to reduce their marketing budget because they have these AI tools? What would the effect be on creative agencies, on media agencies? Because AI can be used in multiple different ways, maybe unevenly. It seemed like Klarna was talking about a lot of AI image generation that it was using to sort of put out advertising. So
like Midjourney and DALL-E and Firefly.
I don't even know if that's good.
Yeah.
I haven't seen these ads myself.
I really want to see the ads. And I suppose from what I'm looking at, it would, creating lots of different images very quickly. That's what AI is very good at. I just wonder what the quality is like.
And issues around copyright that we were just mentioning in terms of, are the artists that created the images that then were used to help generate other images, like, are they at all going to be at some point in the future given some sort of level of compensation? Seems like no. But that's also problematic.
Yeah, and I'd wonder, because this seems to touch on the creative side, but what about the kind of media optimization and placements, and be interested to hear from listeners what they think of what AI could do with something like that in media, and if it could generate those kinds of savings. I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, and is it a risk to the business model of agencies, or of just some of the work that people in media are doing? If brands can do a lot of more in-house work, how much do they need necessarily experts? Some people, I think the quote from Scott Galloway, for instance, is, AI is not going to take your job, but people who know how to use AI will take your job. We might be starting to see this play out very soon.
Yeah, so AI agencies, for instance.
That would be interesting. Yeah. If anyone out there has heard of anything, let us know.
There were a number of additional stories this week. Jack, can you run us through those?
In retail media news, PayPal has announced it will create a new advertising platform and has appointed Mark Grether as general manager of PayPal Ads, who joins from Uber Advertising. In agency news, Total Media Group has consolidated with Europe's largest independent media agency, Media Plus. In online publishing news, far-right entrepreneur and former Republican presidential candidate Vivek Ramaswamy has taken a minority stake in BuzzFeed and is reportedly pressuring the company to cut jobs and hire more conservative voices, including potentially Tucker Carlson. Meanwhile, the Daily Beast, new ownership is reportedly seeking voluntary buyouts from about a third of the company's editorial staff as they look to cut costs. And in streaming news, in an interview with the New York Times, Netflix CEO Ted Sarandos said he doesn't want the streaming giant to compete directly with the likes of prestige TV outlets like HBO, but to be more like HBO, CBS, and the BBC wrapped into one as it amps up non-prestige content deals such as in sports.
Interesting. Thanks so much, Jack. I think that's all we have time for, but until next time, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Ella.
Thanks again for listening to the Media Leader podcast. If you like what you hear, guess what? You can read our stuff at our website, themedialeader.co.uk, where you can sign up to our daily newsletter in the UK of analysis, opinion and commentary about what's going on in media and advertising. You can also find us on YouTube. We are posting video interviews and clips from our live events. And don't forget to check out our LinkedIn page, which is offering a very interesting way to see what people in the industry are saying about our articles and the issues we write about. Anyway, get back to work. Catch you next time. Bye bye.